Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on modernizing incident response, how traditional incident response fails enterprises, CISOs, and customers. My name is Andy Lunsford. I'm co-founder and CEO of BreachRx. A little bit about my background. I come from the legal side of the world. I've spent over 20 years in data breach litigation, privacy law, cybersecurity law, really lived with a lot of clients on all the long tail consequences that come from data breaches, and excited to be here with you today. Quick, just background on the problem we're talking about today. It is this growing challenge that CISOs and organizations are facing to deal with the regulatory complexity that comes with data breaches. So there's now over 200 plus data breach laws across the world, and we're seeing that 70% of the costs that companies expend when they deal with incidents come across the whole business and not just security. So we're going to talk a little bit about that dynamic with panelists today. Then obviously what's top of mind for many CISOs is this personal liability aspect that came about from the Uber case and the SolarWinds case, and we'll dive into that here in a bit shortly. I have two awesome panelists joining me today. So first, Renee Guttmann. She is a very accomplished CISO, spending over 30 years in that seat. She's been at Coca-Cola, Royal Caribbean, Time Warner, and now she has her own business called CISO Hive, where she advises other CISOs on putting together top flight programs. And then my other panelist, Tim McKnight, he is now an operating partner at Sin Ventures, but prior to that, he was the CISO for SAP, also serving that same role at Thomson Reuters, GE, Fidelity, Northrop Grumman, BAE Systems. And I like to joke that his favorite job today is being a BreachRx board member, which he does a great job of. And then with that, I'm going to bring on the panelists and we will jump right in. So why are the traditional methods of responding to incidents no longer adequate given the new way the world works from a digital perspective, and on top of that, all these regulatory expectations we have?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Andy. And I think part of the reason that we're seeing that the traditional methods, and I want to define a traditional method as, a playbook that has been developed, at points in time, because nobody really keeps it current, right? So you're basically working off something that's almost static. And I think that is no longer going to work for us because our environments are changing so quickly. There are new applications showing up all the time. You've got not just your environment, but you've got all your SaaS environment. I read that SaaS breaches have increased by almost 300% year over year. You've got third parties, you've got your supply chain. And then I think a bigger problem is the fact that you've got a lot of systems that are not being managed by IT. So they're managed by some stakeholder. You may not even know, that system exists. I found out that we were signing contracts at one of the companies that I worked for, and we were actually signing up for security requirements that I didn't even know anything about, right? So I didn't even know that we had a breach obligation to a third party because we had subscribed to the data. So I think the systems are changing, the processes within our organization. Like I said, you've got a lot of stakeholders doing things that we don't even know about. And then you've got the number of regulations. When I worked at Coca-Cola, it was a global company. We were on almost every country except two. And I was, just trying to think about all the different ways that we were going to keep up with that. And I know that it was almost a full-time job for our legal staff. And I know that it was also very expensive. So, and I was at another conference recently, and somebody mentioned DORA, and I hadn't even heard of DORA. I think it's, what is it, the Digital Operations Resiliency Act. And so you can't even keep up with what's today, but you don't even know how you're going to keep up with the new rules and regulations that are going to be coming up in the future. So I think it's just really difficult to stay on top of it when you're using things that are really developed and even practiced as a point in time. It has to be more continuous, in terms of how we think about incidents.
You raised so many great points there, Renee, that I think one of the ones that is close to my heart being a lawyer is this regulatory aspect, because there are now 200 plus global regs across the country, across the world, that have to do with incident response, data security oriented requirements. And they're changing, as you said, pretty rapidly. If you just look at 10 years ago, we probably had less than half as many regs that were in scope, and another 10 years before that, and we had just a small handful of regs you had to worry about. And they just continue to evolve to where even once you get one in place, and you may adjust all of your incident response procedures around this new law. Like California's CCPA is a good example. It was passed, and then within a year, it was amended to have even more additional requirements around it. So you have this need as a company to be keeping track of that, and that's just one aspect of the incident, is the legal aspects. And you also mentioned the contract pieces. I think that now, anytime you have two companies that are exchanging data, there's this obligation from both sides as to what do you do when you have a breach with the other side's data. What are those requirements? And most of our customers, when we talk to them, the security team doesn't necessarily know what all those requirements are. They may have a 24-hour requirement for a suspected incident, as an example, and have no idea that that's even on the radar.
And Andy, I want to raise something. About 6 months ago, I started to look at the 10Ks that were being written and how they were changing because of the new SEC rule. And I was doing silly things like word counts. I'd go back and look at 2022, and then I go download 2023. In some cases, I'd say it was 30% more. And the part that was really interesting for me is that the part that was really added was much more about how they would handle an incident. So these organizations were documenting how they would handle an incident, and they were talking about the board oversight. They would talk about the frequency of their tabletops. And so, it's not even just the outside, it's basically living into your own, agreements that you're making with your shareholders, that you've got to be careful I would say, to be able to evidence that, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, I did it, but it'd be nice to have some living proof that that actually took place.
Yeah, that's another great point. I think one of what we're hearing from more and more CISOs, especially if they're CISOs at a publicly traded company, is that they believe these new SEC requirements have really made it to where your incident response records are being audited like financial records. It's the same level of scrutiny, and you can actually see that in a lot of the post-incident court filings we've seen since the new rules in place, where the SEC is not just looking at that particular breach you may be notifying about. They're actually going to look at the incidents you've gone through over the past 5 or 6 years, just to see, do you have fulsome records on them? Are you following the same process every time? Are you escalating the proper way? And so that's just a very different dynamic before, and I take a lot of this blame as being part of the legal community. Our advice used to be write nothing down. Like we want to minimize the amount of evidence we create. We need to have as little as possible. And I think that's part of why we have such a proliferation of all these regulations, is that they want more transparency. They want to see that when you had an incident, you handled it responsibly, efficiently, effectively for your customers, for the greater public good, all those things. And when you have minimal records, it's really hard to actually prove that after the fact. Tim, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this evolution from traditional incident response methods and kind of where we're going in this new digital world we live in.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So no, certainly I agree with Renee. Being how you practice is how you play, right? Which is I love my sports, and it's that season again for football. So I think that the challenge with any breach is organizing the team on the field, number one. Making sure they know what the playbook is that they have to run, that they've run it before, whether in practice or otherwise. And I agree that, the days of old where we said, well, we did that, are gone. I think the ability to capture it, upload it, verify that an action happened is critical. And I got to tell you, in some of the things I've dealt with in my career, some can go on weeks, some can go on years. some can involve tens of people, some can involve hundreds of people across an organization. So the complexity grows with time, and certainly with the criticality of the incident itself and the materiality, obviously, as well. And I think certainly every CISO right now should be looking for a company like BreachRx to help solve that problem for them. And I know I'm the former FBI guy too. So back in the 90s, I used to be the guy who would show up and tell you, I'm here to help you. And in some cases, you may end up with a nice pair of you might be locked up, let's put it that way, as a result of your helping me because maybe you committed a crime or you were perceived to have committed a crime. And that's what we want to prevent here, right? It's the ability for a CISO, when an incident may go to court years later, to be able to actually point directly to, here's who had the action, here's what actions were taken, here's the information we had at the time. And that's not easy, and certainly, but I think it's part of the job now, and I think every CISO needs BreachRx.
Yeah. The other thing that, I've never had big teams. I've had, medium-sized teams, directly reporting to me. And then I've also had, third parties, right? And part of the issue was just even communicating between, the independent SOC, or we had, a managed service provider. And it was trying to remember and identify, not just within my organization, but everybody else that we need to engage with. And because I had small teams, people like to sleep, it's surprising, they do. And so when you wake them up at 2 a.m. in the morning, they're like, I don't know, like, I mean, how quickly it takes for people to sort of turn on. For me, it's almost impossible at 2 a.m. But you've got to turn on, and you're expected to be like running on all cylinders when you're barely awake and you're waking everybody else up about the same time. So, I think that, the more that can be, created as a workflow, and then the outreach to the other parties can be, more effective and efficient. I think that's absolutely
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll add a
critical.
little
The
more.
other thing is consistent. Yeah, go. No,
No,
go. Oh, you're gonna add a little more?
no, all I was going to say was highlight what you said earlier around, knowing what your customer commitments were or your regulator
Yeah.
commitments. And you don't want to be trying to figure that out in the midst of your worst day, right? So I think having that captured is really critical. So back to you.
And then, no, I want to talk about consistency and just being able to follow a process and know that it's the process that you all agreed on. And I'll share a story. A long time ago, we had a website and somebody started sharing the passwords, the privileged passwords. And we had a problem, as you can imagine. And we did investigate, and we found out, who the two people were that had been doing this. And we investigated, we called them in. They in fact admitted that they did this, and they were terminated. Well, a couple months later, the company gets a note, and I think it was an EEOC complaint. And the complaint basically said that my department did not investigate all situations of shared password use of privileged accounts, and that they were fired, wrongly, that they were wrongfully dismissed for this. And so then the obligation fell back to me and my team to prove that this is actually how we went about doing things. I mean, it wasn't something that happened every day. So I didn't have a lot of situations that I could, pull up and say, yeah, this is, how we absolutely do this. But I did have to prove something, to make that EEOC complaint go away. And I don't even know what I pulled out, because this was like 20 years ago. I don't know how I proved it anymore, but I know that I was certainly stressed, when that complaint came across.
And that reminds me of, I think, one of the challenges in incident response and why that static incident response paper plan is so problematic in today's world is what you're talking about is like you face a situation that you might necessarily, like, I doubt that specific situation is laid out in an incident response plan. You might not even have a specific playbook for it, but you need you have all these different competing obligations and procedures that you want to potentially enter into whatever scenario you're in, and that was a huge key tenet for us in the design of our product. Was we want to be flexible enough to handle whatever type of incident you may be facing, and really presenting you with the guided next steps that you need to follow, whatever those scenarios might be. Keeping in mind what are those regulatory potential obligations, contractual obligations, and other kind of control obligations you have as a company. And it's really tough when you think about the traditional approach with this incident response plan, and even playbooks that people generate in a paper form. They're static, they're just long checklists, and having somebody read through those to try to find the relevant pieces that might apply in a given scenario is extremely time consuming. And as Tim, you said it a minute ago, like when you're in the heat of the moment and you've got to move quickly, there's no time to go through an encyclopedia of paper documents to figure out what I should be doing.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, it brings up lots of memories for me. And they're all good. Don't worry. I had the same superpower that Renee had, which is the ability to stay calm in the worst of situations. But I think the other part BreachRx brings is it's not just your security team, right? You're operating with every team across the company, whether it's the communications and public relations folks, it's the government folks, it's you name it, the treasury, and the ability to sit down with them early, before the bad day. And I remember this for one example where I think I sat down with the CFO, and he wasn't sure why was my security guy in the room with me. What does he have to tell me? To which, I had a list of items. And one of them happened to be, when we have a major breach, we think it's material, we have to stop any trading of shares by executives in the company, right? And of course, this was the first time he ever heard that in his life from the security officer of the company. But it was so critical, right? I mean, and just capturing that, but also making him accountable, or someone in the treasury or his team accountable, to make sure that happened when we actually called the event, was important. Because you're right, your security team's not thinking about that when they're in the middle of trying to expel an actor from an environment, close down some configurations, or patch some systems. They're dealing with a very different pair of glasses. So I think that's one little example where it's all the teams that have to work together.
You actually raised something that I want to ask Andy, because you mentioned about the stopping of the trading, right? I had a situation. It's a statement and then a question. I had a situation where we had to think about like how we would notify unions. That was one example. Another example is that we filed in one of the states. We sent off an email or went to their website, did something, and we didn't notify our external auditors. And they came back a year later and they were some mad. And then it became like a question of, well, whose job is it going to be to notify the external auditors if we file something? Andy, do you have a way that you can actually, maybe start to think about, like, do you share best practice along the way? Like, because these are things that, frankly, they stumped me. And the other problem is that the law department, they wanted me to foot the bill to go get external counsel to help us figure out the answer. That's not a nice gift.
Yeah. Good way to blow right through the budget for the year when you get those kind of surprises thrown on you. Yeah, that's those kind of things that are supposed to be thought of, and remembered by people when something happens. That's one of the key, again, problems with a lot of the traditional ways of thinking about incident responses. If it's just cataloged in a paper plan somewhere, buried in it, and you're really just, especially a security team, you're focused on, how do I resolve this incident? How do I stop the bleeding? How do we make sure that this is, not going to impact the company going forward? You don't want to spend your time trying to think through, okay, now that we've done this, what are all these cascading communications that need to take place? So the way we've built the platform, and I think to your question, Renee, is we take a lot of these best practices of, okay, part of the next stage in this incident is that you should be notifying an auditor, a regulator, a contractual partner, and making sure that you're prompted with that automatically by the platform, not with somebody needing to remember it, somebody needing to go read through an encyclopedia of documents. You really have that, guided hand-holding, guardrails, so to speak, that just kind of ensure that you're always doing the right thing at the right time. And that's just a huge focus for us.
Yeah, that's good. That's important. Sounds less expensive too.
Yeah, and kind of one of the other questions I had for, maybe I'll start with Tim on this one. When you see, the traditional, I would call it manual approaches to incident response, what do you see as some of the common pitfalls for organizations when they take a more manual approach to responding to incidents?
Yeah, I think it certainly inhibits speed. The ability to move fast. Number one, because you want your team, moving fast during these incidents. Two, it could result in poor quality, right? Because they may skip processes. They may not capture it, because I will say historically security teams, you know, maybe parts of them tend to be better at capturing information than others. But also, again, you're relying on so many parts of the organization, from the CIO to the CTO to the cloud ops leaders and others. So it just introduces a lot of opportunity for gaps and mistakes to happen
Yeah.
from my perspective. So.
Yeah, I think you can have a more of a single point of failure in a situation like that, right? Where you're relying on one person to show up and that knows that thing that knows that person, and if they're not there, another story, I had an incident response leader go off on paternity leave. I mean, you're like, what do you mean? I don't have somebody to drive an incident for 5 weeks, it was really scary. So anyway, the more that, everything had been automated, in fact, we did bring in a third party person, with experience that worked with the team, but, still under circumstances like that, there was still probably a contact list in his head that the rest of us didn't have, things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also add on the fact that even if that person was there for the 5 weeks, people get tired, to
Right.
Renee's earlier
Sleep.
point, that, I've had plenty of times where you just know your team is wiped out, and you're trying to onboard, third parties to help, they're just completely exhausted mentally, physically. So yeah, the ability to capture it, and have a system that can be run by a third party, as well as your own people, or those single points of, awesomeness that you always have a few that are just
Yeah.
incredible, but you burn them out, unfortunately, because so much is on their shoulders during these incidents, and they take it personally too. So you can't rely on that, and over time that just burns out really good people.
It kind of reminds me of another big piece that a lot of our customers focus on is, they either have a small team and so they're trying to kind of punch above their weight with a platform to help have a lot of those extra hands kind of in place, but it's also, how you're training the next generation or the people that are coming up within your org. So if you've got 1 to 3 to 5, whatever, how many super talented folks on your team that you can depend on, it's hard to get all that tribal knowledge from their head passed on to the next person, and invariably that person wants to get promoted into another role, or they might leave the organization for different reasons. How do you really ensure that you can
Yeah.
make that transfer? That's part of the beauty of having a platform in place, is that you can actually have a record of how those talented people dealt with a specific incident, the steps they took, and immediately with a point and click, make that a new playbook, make that a new way to handling whatever situation you're in front of. And the new person comes in, they can see that, they can jump it, they can get prompted with the same tasks that person accomplished in the other incident. So do it the same way again for a consistency basis too.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly that's critical, right? Next player up. I'll keep using sports themes, but yeah, the ability to not only practice and play the same playbook over and over again with varying levels of talent and getting them to rise up, and move into the role when others need to take a break off the field, I think is
Yeah.
really important. So, agreed. And I think BreachRx does that and is doing that for its customers. Absolutely.
Yeah, that raises another question. I think about the traditional approaches of what a lot of people think of as a best practice for incident response is practicing, but it really gets sometimes watered down to not the drilling that you're talking about, Tim, but it ends up being, well, we do an annual tabletop with the executive team, and that's our practice, and we're following best practices by having done that. But talking to hundreds of customers at this point, usually the value out of that tabletop of those, it's really more of a thought exercise that happens. It kind of ends within 24 48 hours of everybody leaving that tabletop exercise, because it really is just sitting around a table and kind of talking through it. It's not actually exercising your process, and doing that on a more regular basis when you're just boiling it down to once a year, and you might not even have all the people on your team show up for that annual tabletop. Be curious if maybe Renee, share some of your experience with tabletops and exercises, and what good and
Yeah, I
bad look.
mean, we went from just having a discussion that bored the leaders to tears and really didn't accomplish anything, to bringing in a third party again at a substantial cost and putting together a team of people to create a valid scenario, for our business that, using the right language, making it real. And then we actually did a root cause analysis. We actually created a post-mortem, if you will, and we actually figured out there were things that if this had really happened to us, and not just within IT, right? Our corp com people figured that they weren't going to be ready, should something happen. That's when we figured out that, oh my God, what about the unions? So it was, I can tell you, it was months of work because we were really asking the executives, we asked for 4 hours, of a very expensive, people that had other things to do to complete the strategy of the company. And of course we wanted it to be good, but yeah, and then we had to repeat something else for the technical teams. I mean, I felt like we were doing a lot of tabletops, but it was also the same resources that I needed to be on an incident. You know what I'm saying? So this was probably not their first priority ever, to sit around with me and create tabletops,
Yeah.
and it was expensive.
Yeah.
So yeah,
No, I agree. I mean, in hindsight, I think so, some of the times we did those tabletops, I'd say they became more of a dog and pony show, an overperformance for the executive team, maybe more educational than really showing them how things worked,
yeah,
right?
I think
So,
so. I
yeah.
think that's right.
So I think that's where BreachRx has the opportunity. I guess if I were CEO for a day, they haven't made that happen yet, but certainly I would probably say, show me how the sausage is made, put me on the floor or put me in the virtual sock and take me through 10 incidents today, right? No different than the days when they said the CEO would get on and answer customer calls, right? It really would be more interesting, I think, for a CEO to see how that really works or doesn't work and where there's opportunity to improve that in the day to day. So,
Yeah, we hear that over and over again from customers, that being able to practice real exercises that are really realistic to what it really feels like, a lot of the uncertainty aspects that are going on, and then making decisions and following up on them, and having that all recorded so you can look back on it too, and have true lessons learned, not
Right.
just what you kind of remember from the situation before. It really drives a lot of value for building that muscle memory. So you truly are meaningfully prepared. And I think that's what everybody's aiming for, is like having an org that is really ready to go when something happens.
yeah, I think it would help the CISO's budget a lot more than those dog and pony shows. Because I certainly have one CEOs just look at me like, "How much are you spending for this?" and with gift bags and everything, and he was, in hindsight, I think he was right. I think he was right. I think the money could have been better spent, and would have been better spent on Breach RX if we had it back then. So
Yeah, I think that's the difference, right? I mean, it I don't recall any. I know there were things, that I could go look at a database of regulations if I wanted to. I knew that kind of service was available, but I do think that a platform that has as much capability as a Breach RX, help driving tabletops all the way through to system of record and the other capabilities. I think they're critical. They're critical capabilities, that CISOs need.
So a good transition to next topic I had that I think we hear just more and more since Joe Sullivan went through his experience at Uber, and Tim Brown's going through his experience at SolarWinds, and a number of other CISOs that aren't maybe necessarily in the it's not necessarily publicly out there what they're going through, but we hear kind of through the grapevine of their experiences. What are those personal liability issues that CISOs are thinking about? Maybe you could share some of your own experiences with that. That'd be great. Renee?
Sure. Well, I haven't talked about it in a way that's as public as this, but it's been so long now that I feel it's okay. Long ago, my organization investigated a stolen laptop situation. And lo and behold, there was some, PI out there, and so notice was filed. And we put it to bed. I thought we put it to bed, okay? And then, the filing was done, and then of course the lawsuits start. Well, I did wind up leaving that company, and then 2 jobs later, I still remember to this day walking across my garden with my daughter and my husband, and this guy throws himself in front of me, hands me a brown envelope, and said, "You've been served." And there are very few times that I think that my legs actually gave out. That was pretty close to one of them. It was the fastest 20 pounds that I've ever lost. And yeah, I had to go and basically be subpoenaed and talk about a situation that happened years ago that I had no record of anymore, and it was scary. And this predates Joe and Tim and a lot of people. And now I ask myself, when would it end? Like you just said it earlier that you could still get called back. And I'm like, well, I'm going to move to some foreign island if that ever happens again. But I don't know, like, is the incident just the beginning? Like, where's the end? And truly it did cost me, even though I was covered, but I felt the need to be more prepared than the counsel that I was provided. So I did hire my own attorney as well, which also became expensive for me, but it felt more personal in terms of how I was being taken care of. So I think that CISOs do feel under pressure because this kind of situation between Joe and Tim, that it can happen. And
Yeah.
yeah.
In that scenario, Renee, when that incident actually happened, it sounds like it's hard to even remember it, but was it even viewed as a significant material incident for the organization at the time?
I mean, it wasn't material, and and that's the other thing. I mean, in today's world, it might have been a yawn. You know what I'm saying? But back then, these kinds of things, when tapes used to fall off trucks, backup tapes, that was about 2008. The thing that I think made this so not terrific was that what the attorneys had were emails written by like everybody and their brother. Okay. Okay, and that's how they pieced together what happened. Again, this was a long time ago, and there were just too many emails and too many people saying things that may or may not have been accurate. People with commentary, people using inappropriate language, uh, anyway, that's so anyhow, I think that having had a real record of what had happened would have been a much better situation for me years later to go back and look at that than to go look at like, however many dozens of emails I had to look at.
Yeah, that reminds me of Joe Sullivan when he's talked about his experience going through all of that incident with Uber. He said in his trial, I think he said they spent 75 to 80% of the time was just piecing together what happened when, who knew what when, who was involved with each individual decision along the way. And prior to our kind of technology being out there, it is that you didn't have any way. People are like, to your point, you're reading emails, you're looking at maybe text messages and trying to piece together what that timeline looks like, rather than like a really purposeful built timeline that it also thinks about privilege and how do you make sure that the conversations that need to be kept internal are truly kept internal with the oversight of counsel versus that factual record that is very clear that you have to have in place now. Curious, Tim, your experience. I know you've talked to me a few times about just when you've exited a company, maybe some of the things that you have to have sewn up today that maybe you didn't have to 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where BreachRx has another great opportunity, right? I mean, I certainly would recommend CISOs don't use email. It sounds crazy, but you're a lawyer. I don't know if you've ever been a prosecutor, but the ability to use everything you say in every email against you. And I know in the Tim Brown situation, right? Even his presentations externally, his blogs, everything was being used, against him, in a sense, to tell the prosecution story, right? I don't know whether it was criminal or civil or whatever it may be, but that's why I think BreachRx could be that operating system where you even report from it, right? I mean, and that was the other thing. Email is a terrible form of communication, right? It doesn't give context, it doesn't give emotion and feeling, doesn't give all the facts. So I think the ability to really progress BreachRx to a point where it's really where you're presenting from. Here's all the data we have. Here's all the information we have. Here's the report that went to the board. Here's the regulator report that went out to the regulators. Here's what we reported to the FBI at that time about what we knew or what we didn't know. And the owners and accountability of all that, right? Because the CISO may be the person who's in the room telling the board, but to be honest with you, the ability for any individual to know every single action that's being taken at any moment is virtually impossible, let alone to recall it, 3 or 4 years later, is absolutely impossible. And you won't even have access to that information. So, I certainly think that that's where it should be headed. I mean, if I were still in a CISO role, I certainly would be going that direction as fast as I can, and certainly communicating to your team as well, because there's always those snarky comments and emails of, I can't believe they did that, right?
Right.
Or, oh my God, what were they thinking?
Yeah.
And none of those things, it's emotion at the time, but it may or may not be accurate, but certainly can be used against you in any way, shape, or form. So
Yeah, and I just have to say this. I think that people think this is the sexiest part of the job, right? Is to have an incident, right? This is what we all live for, maybe not. And I remember getting an email one time and it said meeting canceled due to security breach. Like just right. I mean, thank you, God. What a gift.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when one of the conversations I had with Joe last week, what he was talking about how incident you have to prepare, respond, and recover. That's kind of the three pieces that a lot of people think about frameworks of being a security org. But there's an awful lot more attention paid to detecting and defending technology, a lot of your budget, a lot of your time, 95%. And then you have this small amount of time that's spent on preparation for incidents and dealing with incidents. But when it comes down to what you're judged on as an organization, as a security team, as an individual, you get judged more on how you handle those incidents than you do on that thing that you're spending 95% of your time and money on. And so, his perspective is that as a CISO that has experience, that needs to shift, because if you really want to have a top flight security program, you need to be top flight at incident response, because that's where you're going to be judged number one. And how does that, if you think back, I know you both are fortunately are recovering CISOs at this stage. But if you were to put yourself in the seat of hopping into new org, and you're thinking about how do you look at your program as a whole, where do you put incident response on the priority list when you're coming into a new org?
I think you have to be prepared from day one. So it's pretty darn important to find out what your capabilities are as a team, and to at least put some basics in place, and try them out. They were my when I think about hiring people, right? This is one of the top jobs, because you need somebody that can be cool. You need somebody that can be a leader. You need somebody that can see big picture things. And it's a very special person, by the way, that I think that wants to do incident response. So anybody that's doing that in the audience, I'm telling you, you're a saint. But it's so important, because it can happen. I'll tell you what, I had one job, and on day 2, honest to God, day 2, they couldn't keep the websites up. And I was trying to meet my people. I was trying to meet them and, to get to know them. They were my new team. And all of a sudden they're all looking at their phone and they're like, hey, we got to go. And then I thought, well, let me go see where they're going. So they go up to a war room, right? And they're literally in the war room trying to figure out now how to basically bring these websites, back into production. And then I remember actually telling them they had to do something, and that cost $600,000. And then I think on Thursday, because Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the CEO called me for lunch. So, like, I don't think you can sit around and wait to be ready anymore.
100%. Tim, what about you when you think, if you were to be inserting yourself into a new org, not that you want to do that right now, but where does incident response rank on your priority list?
Yeah, it's like 1 or 2, depending on the situation I'm walking into. And I've been really lucky to have some of the best, people who lived, breathed, loved every aspect of working really long hours on some really hard problems, in the worst of situations. So, I think that's almost always I've brought in a leader who's been in the war zone before, and fought through some really bad and gnarly and ugly situations, just because, for that reason, right? They've been there before. They know how to manage all parts of the organization. They communicate well, you're leaning on them, they're leaning on you. It's just such a critical role in the organization. So, I've been very lucky in that regard, but it's critical. It's absolutely critical. So, because, there are going to be times where you turn to them and you say, what do you think? And you agree, you disagree, but then you make a decision and you move. And that's always the challenge here, is whatever little bad information you may have at the time, you've got to make a decision, right? I mean, I always joke to my wife, she hated when I said the only bad decision is the decisions you don't make. And unfortunately, that's just our career, right? They give you whatever little information, you have to make a boatload of decisions and move the organization forward while managing risk for the company, the shareholders, the customers, the board, the executive team, et cetera. So it's a heavy load. It's a heavy load.
Yeah, I mean, I think that anything that, in every case that I can think of that would have jump-started a program, you know, like a solution like this would have been a plus, you know. Um, I have like just thoughts about like when to reinvent the wheel, and this is not it, you know.
Yeah, right when you're facing it. Yeah. Well, I know
Yeah.
we're, yeah, go ahead, Tim.
No, I was just going to say, and I think Renee said it right. It's the ability with BreachRx to bring parties to the table who think they don't have a role. Um, early on is something BreachRx can and will do. And you'll find you're going to get some who are going to be like in some communications role. It's like, oh yeah, I want to be that cyber person. Let me take the lead for this stuff, or you're going to have some that are going to say, oh no, I like the other stuff. I want to go deal with this. But it helps you sort of work cross-functionally, across the organization in a way that's much more effective, more thoughtful, because you're also going to have people outside of your security team who are going to give you their view, which may be very insightful on how to deal with a situation maybe you didn't think about, right? So I think that's really important. I think in the last of my years, the biggest part for me was real engagement with the customer during these incidents is probably one of the hardest parts, right? How much do you tell a customer about what's happening? How much do you involve them? How consistent is it across all your customers? So imagine they're really difficult questions, and somebody's got to make a decision on them and own it. And having that all prepared and run through beforehand will only make your life a whole hell of a lot better. So, like I say, you can be a best athlete on the worst day of your life. So.
And the challenge now too is just with the type of regulatory scrutiny we have with all these different regulations is that's going to be, Monday morning quarterback, back to sports analogies
Right.
of every single decision you made. And so
Yeah.
it's so critical to have captured, hey, this is a reasonable thing for us to have decided to do based on what we knew at that time. And it's a lot easier for somebody else to be like, well, now we have all the facts. You really should have done these 10 things, but you
Yeah.
didn't know that day one.
Yeah, I seriously worry for, in Joe's situation, will you ever have peers on a jury who would understand any of this? To be very honest with you. So I think having all this captured and accountable and repeatable prevents it from ever getting to that point, right? And that's what we ideally want, right? Because I just know, if you presented this to 99 out of 100 people would have no idea what you're talking about when you're like, oh, we had a cyber attack and, the breach was made and then they asked for ransom. I mean, it's going to be, blah, 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 blah. They're going to have no idea what you're talking about. And you're relying, no offense to the lawyers, you have lawyers who are going to have to interpret that for them,
Oh, yeah.
in a way that makes sense.
Yeah,
And
from 70,000 emails, right?
right. It's just not,
So,
it's not feasible. It's not feasible. So.
I know we're about to hit time here, and we got a bunch of questions that came in the chat. Maybe just one quick one, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. This is for Renee or Tim. What are the best ways for CISOs to ensure coordination across different departments and stakeholders during an incident? So I know, Tim, you just talked about dealing with your customers, but maybe just internally across the org. What are the best ways to ensure coordination there?
Yeah, I guess my view is to make sure you have accountable people for each of those areas who are going to help drive it with you, right? You really need a sort of a field general for each, whether it's the comms folks, whether it's the PR folks, it's the legal, someone has to take the lead and be around the table and responsible for really driving the decision making and coordinating feedback back into sort of the command center, because somebody's got to take all that and then present it to the board or the executive team in a way that makes sense as to these were the highest priorities that were occurring over the last 12 hours. Here's the actions that were taken. Here's what we have up next. I mean, that's the type of discussion that, most boards are looking for. You can't take them through every single detail. So
I also think holding them accountable for whatever their commitment is. I've just been in situations where you get back together and maybe so-and-so didn't exactly do what they said they were going to do. Like, that's pretty depressing. when you're trying to move at speed, right? So knowing who to ask, making sure they're responsible, but also accountable, right? And holding them accountable.
Great point.
Yeah, that was one of the big focuses for Breacher X, being kind of that place to pull everybody together where it's really clear who owns this, who owns that, and
Yeah.
having that single source of truth so that it's clear everybody's on the same page. We all know the same information at the same time, and we can make the decisions according to that. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I know we have several other questions in the chat. We will follow up with you all individually afterwards, but just want to thank everybody for joining us today, especially thanking our panelists, Tim and Renee. Really appreciate all the candid conversation, all the stories. It's amazing how fast the time flies when you're having fun. And if you want to reach out to us to talk more about BreachRx, please reach out via our email here, info@breacherx.com, or hit our website. Would love to talk about incident management and how we can help you out. Thank you.